Before we kick off our discussions, let's see what the public has to say.
People lost lives and died, for freedom, including freedom of speech. So I think the media should be allowed to say whatever they want to say, Because that's like government saying, we're going to control you guys, Look what happened to the Zim media. Like the government in Zim controls whatever comes out, It's like we're going back to the apartheid days,
Take the best example, Julius Malema. We never really hear, we only see the bad side of his behavior, and the way the media puts it across as if he's a bad person. I'm not necessarily a good person, but he is a person with an opinion that voices it out very loudly, and nobody really gives that good side to him where he can voice it in a better manner.
I think it's oppressive. I think it's regressive, because we need a free media, a free press. Right back hundreds of years ago, people were already pamphleteering to have a free press. Not to have a free press means that we are cut off from information. And if we're cut off from information, we don't have the wherewithal to make correct decisions.
I understand where the government right now is actually coming from as well, because they will make certain mistakes, like on front page, and give like misinformation. And 3 months down the line, the apologies, like on page 27, small part, that is not fair as well to the people who are being wronged,
Media is doing a good job. Government must not intervene in whatever media is saying.
We all need parameters in our lives, whether it's called a tribunal or a conscious mind or our own ethics and values. We all need that in place to keep ourselves in check. Otherwise, there's no limitations.
There's no media freedom in Zimbabwe, and we're going exactly the same way. And this is not about protecting the poor, it's about protecting the elite.
Well, joining us now to get to the heart of the matter, our Director of the Journalism Program at Wits University, Professor Anton Harber, and Executive Director at the Freedom of Expression Institute, Aisha Kaji. Aisha and Anton, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to start with you, Anton. This media tribunal, what does that exactly mean for press freedom?
Well, it's difficult to say specifically, because all the ANC has proposed at the moment is that there be an investigation by Parliament of the idea of a media tribunal. But they've made it clear, or at least a number of ANC people have made it clear, that their view is that there needs to be stronger regulation in order to take action against media that gets it wrong, journalists that make mistakes, that don't correct things properly. They feel that there are too many ethical and factual errors, and they want to put a stop to that. In terms of media freedom, I think there's a great concern that we have a self-regulatory system, which I think is established around the world as best practice in terms of dealing with media issues. And it's imperfect, but it's not a bad system. And it would be a grave pity to see that being replaced by a system in which politicians are telling us what we can or cannot do.
But the word tribunal, does that not concern you at all?
It does, because a tribunal throws up images of stern men waving their finger and wearing judicial robes and wigs, and sending journalists to prison or leveraging large fines. So yes.
So Aisha, where should the line be drawn between what the public should know and sensationalism?
Well, Jackie, I'm not for 1 minute saying that journalists should be above the law. In the same way as we hope our politicians and business people and all kinds of other professionals are not above the law, so too journalists are not above the law. We're not saying they shouldn't be regulated. What we're concerned about, though, is, as Fenley so rightly pointed out, this issue of a tribunal conjures up images of state regulation, and very often repressive state regulation. So really the line should be drawn at the limits enshrined in our constitutions, the limits to freedom of expression and a free press. And those limits currently are the limitations on hate speech, propaganda for war, and incitement to violence. Other than that, there are no limitations really on freedom of expression, other than when they have to be balanced against other rights.
So what about sex scandals? Is that really necessary to report on a sex scandal, for example?
Well, usually sex scandals are reported about public figures, politicians, celebrities, etc. When people enter public life, they give up some of their privacy rights. In entering public life, they knowingly do this. So yes, sometimes their private lives and the way they conduct those private lives do have considerations for how they might be using, for example, public monies.
Yeah.
Anton, your views?
Well, there is a price to be paid for freedom of speech. It does mean that there can be invasions of privacy and some unpleasantness, but there's a much greater price to pay for giving up freedom of speech in terms of its impact on democracy, in terms of the restrictions it will put on the public debate and discussion we so badly need in a young democracy.
Yeah. Should public figures give up privacy?
Well, they shouldn't give up total privacy, but they certainly give up some.
Where are the boundaries then?
Well, there aren't clear boundaries, and it's a question of judgment each time. I must say, one man's expose is another man's sensationalism.
Yeah.
One man's privacy and is another man's right to know. They aren't clear, but there are questions of taste. There are very clear invasions of dignity which can't be justified and which should be stopped.
Yeah. So where is the problem right now? The fact that there's a media tribunal coming to pass or coming into effect, where is the problem? Is this our newsroom that's not properly regulated? Is that the juniorization of the newsroom? Where is the concern?
Oh, I think it's an invented problem.
Okay.
I think it's a political problem that stems from some ANC leaders who've been severely embarrassed by expose in the media. And yes, there have been some cases where it has been unfair, but there's been many more cases where it was spot on and embarrassed people, and political figures always like to put a stop to those kinds of exposes.
The concern that was raised about the media tribunal is that there's not correct recourse. For example, in terms of the print media, they're not happy with the fact that the retraction is made on the 5th page when the headline was on the 1st page, versus the broadcast industry. So there's two entities here. Would you agree with that?
I think that the comparison is not an apt comparison, firstly. That's because we're dealing with two very different types of media. And the regulation of broadcast media is necessarily a regulation of a very specific type because there's limited spectrum available, etc. However, many comments have been made trying to conflate the two issues and saying, well, the broadcast media falls under the ICASA, the Independent Communications Authority. While this is true in principle, actually the ICASA Act allows broadcast media organs, both radio and TV, to decide whether they choose to fall under the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, the BCCSA, which is a self-regulatory body, and if they choose not to fall under that, then they automatically fall under ICASA's Complaints Commission. So there is a choice available to broadcast media. Secondly, the established best practice around the world, and in fact the preferred option even by the African Union itself, is the self-regulatory option. Recently, various countries have done investigations into the best method of regulation. And a study in New Zealand of over 80 countries actually again found that self-regulation was the preferred way to go. Ireland strengthened its self-regulation. New Zealand strengthened its self-regulation. I think what's happened in this country is that the ANC has been somewhat premature in bringing up this issue of a tribunal, which, as I said, conjures up the image of state regulation. So going from total self-regulation to, at least in principle, talking about state regulation without looking at what the other options in between those two extremes.
What are the other options?
Well, firstly, there's the option of better strengthening the current self-regulatory system by, for example, bringing in a more robust code of journalistic ethics that everybody signs up to, by strengthening and better resourcing the Press Council and the Press Ombud, by perhaps introducing greater public input in much the same way as the BCCSA did into its code, bringing in public input into a code of press journalism ethics, etc. So there are a lot of different options that could be considered before we go to state regulation or even talk about state regulation. Some countries also have co-regulatory mechanisms. Other countries such as Denmark, India, etc. have a regulation enshrined in law, but it is a regulation that is jointly decided by the industry and in fact largely populated by the industry with some oversight, say, by retired judges, etc.
Yeah. Anton, what's the answer? What's the solution here?
I believe it's to strengthen our self-regulation and stick with self-regulation.
And how do we do that?
I think, you know, if there's a concern that apologies appear on page 5 and the story is on page 1, there's a simple rule which says give it equal prominence. And the ANC could go and talk to the Ombudsman and try and discuss changing the rules in that way. If there's a concern that the press council system we have is sometimes a bit slow, well, it's a simple change of rules to say you have 30 days or 60 days in which to finalize a complaint. Those things are easily fixed. The system is not perfect. It was beefed up about 2 years ago. It was significantly improved. And those things could easily deal with those particular problems.
Yeah. If a media tribunal does come to pass, what happens to our legal system? Because a defamation, in terms of you go to the court. You don't go to the press ombudsman, you go to the court. So what does a media tribunal do if it does come to pass?
Well, you will still have the choice. Either you can follow the regulatory route,
yeah,
or you can go to court.
Okay.
And that remains a choice you have now, and I expect that will remain the choice. So if you want to sue and pay for lawyers and go through that process, you still have that option.
Because the issue was that not everyone can afford to go to a court. Therefore, a tribunal is there to assist with those matters for Joe Public.
Yes, but it's a ridiculous contradiction. It's impractical. Because a tribunal that might have the power to jail journalists or even levy heavy fines would require due process in terms of our constitution. That means lawyers, that means long processes of appeal, and it would take time. It defeats that purpose anyway.
Right.
And if you want to make it quick and easy and cheap, you've got to take money out and get quick rulings and quick judgments and quick apologies.
Yeah. In terms of self-regulation, should the media not be looking at itself and saying, is there really a juniorization in the media? Is there really a brain drain within journalists leaving the country? What's your opinion on that?
You know, the media does a fair amount.
Factual errors, it's concern.
The media does a fair amount of introspection most of the time. And there has been a loss of skills, a loss of experience, and our newsrooms have shrunk under financial pressure. Those are real problems that we need to face up to.
Yeah.
Now, if we had a commission that looked into how to strengthen and support the media and resource the media and overcome these economic and other pressures, now that would be an interesting development.
Yeah, we won't even get to that because we've got other crises that we're trying to sort out right now. Yeah. Let's look at the international media. How different is it in terms of this media tribunal coming to pass?
Well, as I said earlier, best practice has been, the preferred mode has been self-regulation. We have, as the FXI, currently commissioned some research looking at what other countries around the world do. In most countries, there is a self-regulatory system. Some of them, as I mentioned, have recently tried to strengthen that by better resourcing the press council, putting more people in place, introducing a limited time in which complaints are addressed, etc., introducing the equal prominence for apologies as for the original story. So if the original story ran on page 1 or as a headline, you would publish with the same kind of column space, column inches, etc., the apology, etc. So there are a lot of different options that can be used. Some of the co-regulatory mechanisms are quite interesting, where again, as I said, they're dominated by the media, so they usually have a preponderance of journalists, editors, and press owners or people seconded by them. But then some also have, for example, university academics, journalism schools. Others have literature councils on the press regulator. And in many cases, they are chaired by judges or retired judges of the highest court in the land. So that is certainly an option we could be looking at. The discussion is a welcome discussion, but the discussion on a tribunal and on statutory control is a dangerous slope to be on, because wherever that's happened around the world, we've seen repression of the media. Ethiopia is a good case in point, where in a single year, 10 publications were closed down, and 5 years after the fact, most of the journalists that were put out of work by this are still unemployed or have had to leave the country to gain employment.
Yeah. Aisha, what's happening in the UK? Let's look at the other side of the coin, because it seems that politicians are under constant scrutiny in terms of sex scandals. The US, Bill Clinton, for a case in point. Right or wrong?
But the UK case is very interesting because there was an outcry a couple of years ago because journalists did extraordinary unethical things in tapping the phone of Prince William or Prince Charles. I can't remember which prince it was. So that was a very clear ethical and breach of the law. And they had a review of their system, and their finding was stick with self-regulation. Even though there was push and there was pressure and there was political pressure to tighten up, they said stick with self-regulation. It's an imperfect system, but it's the best possible system. If you have a problem with journalists tapping the phone of Prince Charles, use the law.
Yeah.
Right, right.
But like a story of like Nicolas Sarkozy, for example, where everyone heard about his sex scandal. Is that what they're trying to clamp down in South Africa?
No, I don't think sex scandals are really the issue here.
Yeah, it was the freedom of privacy that was brought up as well.
Privacy and dignity are big isses here, and there's a particular sensitivity given our history around issues of dignity, and I think we must understand and accept that. And there have been stories which have been at least controversial, and the most famous story, of course, is the printing of the medical records of the former Minister of Health in the Sunday Times. That was justified on the basis that she was drinking while having a liver transplant. So I think the courts, I mean, it went to court. The courts ordered them to return the medical documents, but found that there was enough public interest to justify publishing it. So the courts backed the journalists.
But isn't that the issue, though? That as a society, we love to read the tabloids, you know, and negative things about people in public figures.
Yes, but if you're the Minister of Health, and there's allegations that you're jumping the queue to get a liver transplant and you're drinking at the same time,
that's of concern.
I'm afraid that's something the public wants and needs to know about.
Well, what happens when the media in South Africa is regulated, but the international media comes to South Africa? How will they be regulated exactly?
Well, depending on the final outcome of this, because we really haven't had much discussion on what form this media tribunal will take. It's all very fuzzy at the moment.
It's all up in the air at the moment.
But depending on the outcome of that, there are again several options that the state might choose to go if it does go for some form of statutory regulation. And as I said earlier, that's a dangerous slope. You have countries around the continent and indeed around the world where statutory regulation means that international media are not allowed to operate freely within the country. And that would be, I think, a shame not only for the public interest of South Africans, but for the rest of the world wanting to know about South Africa and wanting to get information free information flow in both directions.
Take Zimbabwe as a case in point.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people, Andrew just saw on the insert, that people are concerned that we might go that way. Anton, is that a reality? Should we be concerned?
We should be concerned. We will have to fight to protect our media freedom and our freedom of speech, but we do have a constitution, and the constitution is unequivocal in its defense of media freedom and for the principles of transparency, openness and accountability. We have a strong constitutional court. So I remain reasonably confident that that will protect us.
Let's look at government intervention generally, good or bad. Because we've seen that intervention can create opportunities, for example, new pay channels or more free-to-air channels. But when is it not a good idea for government to get involved?
I think it's a good idea for government to get involved if it means their involvement will increase the range of media sources available to people.
Which they've done.
Which they've tried to do and certainly done with more success, I think, in the broadcast media than in the print sector. So there are, again, a range of options open to government there, not least amongst them strengthening the Media Development and Diversity Agency. You know, the initial discussions around the MDDA were diluted somewhat when the MDDA actually came into being as a result of a variety of different constraints. Maybe a re-looking at the role of the MDDA would be one manner in which we can increase the information sources available to the public. At the end of the day, though, in terms of commercial media, yes, some media organs will always be tabloidy, will always be sensationalist, but then consumers vote with their pockets. You go to the media organ that you most trust. And if there's a range available to you, then that is the very basis of a free, democratic, and public participatory society.
So are we making a mountain out of a molehill, Anton? Is this really something we should be even chatting about?
Very definitely. The ANC has said they want it. The president has supported it. The biggest province now, Gauteng.
But you just said we've got a strong constitution, and at no point will that be bypassed.
No, we'll have to fight to protect the constitution. We'll have to go to court. We'll have to fight in every possible way to protect our rights within the constitution. We do, because of the constitution and the constitutional court, have a defense system that we never had under apartheid. So we're in a stronger position than ever before to defend those principles in the constitution.
And you're saying don't roll over as media?
No, if you allow politicians to invade our rights, they will.
But hasn't media always fought for freedom of speech? It's not just a given. It's always a fight, isn't it?
Certainly in this country, it's always been a fight. It's been a fight under the apartheid era. Some media were collusive under that regime. But many very brave media organs and very brave journalists stood up and really opposed the system. And we should not forget that these freedoms now enshrined in our constitution are very, very hard won. Many people paid with their lives.
Right.
Yeah. So let's look at the media itself. What role should media be playing in terms of bringing social cohesion into a country?
Well, I think that's really the government's role, social cohesion, etc. Media does have a role to play. They play that role in reporting at a local level, in reporting development initiatives, etc.
But is the media aware on a cultural level what is sensitive, what's insensitive, etc.?
I don't think that it's the media's role to police, or it ought to be the media's role to police itself regarding cultural sensitivities and politician sensitivities, etc. That's not the media's role. Again, the consumers of the media will choose to buy or not, as the case may be. And if the consumer feels they've been culturally insensitive, then that media organ will not get support.
Yeah. Do you agree, Anton?
I would go further. I would say that the freedom of speech includes the freedom to be rude, obnoxious, and make mistakes. And we protect those rights as well.
Okay.
We're quite a noisy society, and we're quite thick-skinned, and we're quite robust in our debate. And that was the democracy, that noisy vuvuzela democracy that was on show to the world during the World Cup.
Yeah.
And we love that. And we're going to defend that. We don't want to become all meek and mild and soft-spoken and nice and polite to each other. We argue with each other, and that's healthy.
Yeah.
Because the view internationally from us, outside coming in, if we had to have a tribunal, Aisha, what would be the view? Would it put us in a bad light? What would
It would
people
certainly
say?
change perceptions of South Africa as a very free and open society if we were to go from one extreme of self-regulation to the extreme of statutory regulation. But to add to what Anton has said, I also believe that as a very multicultural society, we are in essence a tolerant one. So we tolerate insults to each other's cultures, etc., with a fair degree of calm about it. It's really those who feel that their dignity has been impaired, and again, this comes to public figures who really ought to be expecting this, frankly, where these cultural sensitivities suddenly become mountains when they really are very little molehills.
All right. Aisha and Anton, thank you very much.
Thank you.